Okay, well, it looks like we've got a pretty nice crowd here and people are still coming in, so we will go ahead and get started for tonight.
Okay.
So, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the In the Adirondack Library Zoom series. I am Liz Bellier, the Public Programs Manager at the Adirondack Experience, the museum on Blue Mountain Lake. The Adirondack Experience is the largest, most comprehensive repository of books, manuscripts, maps, and government documents relating to the history of the Adirondacks. Throughout this series, we are excited to bring you inside the library to explore Adirondack life, history, and culture. All of the books in this series, including the book we will be learning more about tonight, are available on the museum's online store. You can check the chat box throughout the evening for important links, and you can also submit any questions through our Q&A feature. And we will do our best during the second half of tonight's presentation to answer any of those questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's presenters. Our interviewer for tonight and throughout this series is Mitch Tyke, station manager of North Country Public Radio and host of Northwoods. Northwoods airs on the fourth Friday of each month on NCPR from 12 to 1 p.m. Weekly episodes feature interviews, on-site recordings, and special features that zoom in on the people and culture of the North Country and remind us what makes this region such a special and unique place to be. And it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author, Daniel Way. Like Seneca Ray Stoddard, Dan has spent much of his life in Glens Falls, New York. He practiced family medicine in the Adirondack Park as a primary healthcare physician for the Hudson Headwaters Heath Network for 38 years before retiring in 2018. He has published 3 books about his medical practice in addition to his most recent work on Seneca Ray Stoddard that we will learn more about tonight. So we will start off this evening with Dan providing an overview of Seneca Ray Stoddard and his personal connection to the photographer. Then Mitch will take over to interview Dan and feature questions from our viewers. And with that, after that, we'll finish up the evening. So without any further ado, I'm gonna get our presentation pulled up. And I will hand it over to you, Dan.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Oops, we're up ahead of ourselves. Slide back. There we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk about my favorite photographer, Adirondacker, and long-lost ancestor, Seneca Ray Stoddard. As many of you may know, I recently published a book about him, and I thought it might be interesting to share with you the journey I've taken that compelled me to write the book and what I've learned since then and what I still want to know. First, some background information about my family roots. Next slide. So my maternal great-grandfather, James Garrett, who you see here, moved his family to Elm Street in Glens Falls from Wilton in Saratoga County right before the Civil War in 1860 to start a dental practice. He bought a dental practice on Warren Street from a Dr. Knox, and he planned on learning the practice from Dr. Knox and then carrying on from there. But then a funny thing happened. The Civil War started, and so he joined the Union Army in 1861 and was in the Adirondack Regiment for over 4 years. But he managed to survive barely and came back to the city to start his dental practice. And there have been Garrett people in Glens Falls, my ancestors, ever since. I myself was born in Glens Falls Hospital along with my older siblings and my mother before me. But I grew up in eastern Pennsylvania near Valley Forge, about 20 miles west of Philadelphia. But even though I lived and grew up in Pennsylvania all the way through college and medical school, I continued my visits to the Glens Falls area. Next. My mother's father and my mother's brother lived in Glens Falls. My grandfather took over the dental practice from his father, and my uncle was practicing with my grandfather when I was young in the same building where my great-grandfather had originally started practice. And it was only just recently that my cousin, Rick Garrett, retired from the dental practice, being the 4th generation dentist in the Garrett family. But anyway, as I was growing up, I spent a lot of visits up in the Glens Falls area. My grandfather had a lake house on Lake George in Pilot Knob, so we had a lot of fun coming up to Glens Falls and Lake George. Next. But I learned about Seneca Ray Stoddard shortly after arriving in Glens Falls. My uncle gave us a housewarming present when my wife and I moved to Glens Falls, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But I learned that Seneca Ray Stoddard was born in Wilton in Saratoga County, so in either 1843 or 44. He lived in a kind of a hand-to-mouth existence almost. His father had a lot of issues, and but he did manage to learn how to paint by working in a factory in Troy where they built railroad cars, and they needed artists to paint scenes on the insides of the cars. So he learned landscape painting from many artists who actually were in the Hudson River School of Painting. And by 1864, after a crazy childhood with his unstable father and his mother who died young, he moved to Glens Falls to start a new life with the plan of becoming a professional artist. But shortly after coming to Glens Falls, he learned photography from one of his customers who had asked him to paint a banner. George Conkey taught him how to use a camera, and it seemed like this was something that was meant to be. He learned to take photographs and began traveling to Lake George, and over the years he traveled extensively through the Adirondacks, taking pictures, and then he began writing guidebooks. He seemed to be possessed with just incredible talent that came from somewhere. And by 1873, he met Verplanck Colvin, who was surveying the Adirondack Park wilderness for the state of New York. And between Verplanck Colvin and Seneca Ray Stoddard, their skills worked so well together that they were able to convince the New York State Legislature to pass the legislation that created the Adirondack Park in 1892. He gave a 3-hour, 250-slide lecture to the New York State Legislature. He just blew them away. And that's one of the reasons why I respect Stoddard so much, because he wasn't just a photographer. He was responsible for creating the Adirondack Park. And sadly, his last blood relative, his great niece Ernestine Stoddard, passed away in the 1980s, and so he has no living blood relatives. Next. Anyway, on my visits up north to Lake George and Glens Falls as a kid growing up, you can see we had a lot of fun. I'm on the left. You can see me on the left, and my cousin Rick is to my left. In that picture, we're on Hens and Chickens Island on Lake George. We had access to motorboats, and we would swim in the lake in the summer. We'd swim off the dock, my grandfather's dock on Pilot Knob. You can see my two cousins and my sister and I sitting on the diving board. And when the weather wasn't so good, we dress up in our great aunt and uncles and grandfather's clothing and just take silly pictures of ourselves. Next. So I had a fond feeling for Lake George, and I also appreciated the beautiful scenery of Lake George. I noticed Richard Dean postcards were for sale everywhere, and I began collecting them, and I began taking my own pictures of Lake George just as if I was making my own postcards. So I appreciated the artistic opportunities of living in such a beautiful place, probably just like Seneca Ray Stoddard did, although I wasn't doing it deliberately at that stage of my life. Next. In fact, when I moved to Glens Falls, I had met my wife, Harriet, in college in our senior year. We both wanted to be doctors. We both went to medical school. We did our family medicine residency together on Long Island, and we planned all along on moving to Glens Falls, which we did in 1980. In fact, we found a house on Coolidge Avenue, which was 3 houses down from where my grandfather lived. And so it was like coming home again. And I took a job working 84 hours every 7 days for 7 days in a row every other week. So it was 84 hours one week and off the next week, working in the Glens Falls Hospital emergency room. And we started a family. So I was very busy with all of this. And at that point in my life, I had no idea who Seneca Ray Stoddard was. Next. But that was changed when, as a housewarming gift, my uncle Dick Garrett gave me a copy of this amazing book written by Maitland DeSormo in, I think it was 1972. He wrote this book about Seneca Ray Stoddard. And I found as I was reading the book that the author, DeSormo, had interviewed my grandfather, Dr. Walter Garrett. You can see his name there on the page, who related an interesting anecdote about how my grandfather, who was Mrs. Stoddard's nephew, recalled a goofy scene where Stoddard and his two sons blew up a pie that his housekeeper had put on the windowsill to cool off, and it pissed her off so much that she quit the job, which I think was his plan all along. But in any case, I realized that my grandfather was related to Stoddard, Mrs. Stoddard's nephew, or to Mrs. Stoddard. He was her nephew. I also read into the book and learned a whole lot about Seneca Ray Stoddard. Next. Then my uncle was tearing down the garage behind his dental office, which was an old wooden building, and in the attic was this trunk that had some amazing stuff in it, including maps by Seneca Ray Stoddard of Lake George, an Adirondack guidebook, an Adirondack scene, actually a Glens Falls scene, a street scene there, which I'll describe more later. And then this interesting card, which appears to be a Valentine that Stoddard made, showing a picture of himself and his wife as owls, with the caption, "The Owled Story." He was quite a comedian, I guess, and he used that phrase a lot in his pictures, showing a romantic couple in one of his pictures. So this sparked my curiosity even more. Next. I began collecting some Stoddard items as I could find them in auctions and online and antique stores, including this book published in 1913, which was actually the last book that Stoddard ever published. And in that book, on the right picture, you can see the oval vignette, the second one down from the right upper corner. That vignette is a picture of my grandfather, Walter Garrett, the dentist, who also at that time in his life was a concert violinist. And so he was one of the distinguished men of Glens Falls, and there was a whole profile on him in that book. Next. So I found myself so interested in Stoddard that, of course, I had to collect as much of his creations as I could find. And in those days, back in the 1980s, you could find first edition guidebooks, books, like you can see in the upper center of the slide. His very first edition of his Lake George guidebook and the first edition of the Adirondacks Illustrated. The Adirondacks book I actually inherited from my grandfather. I collected photographs, many of Glens Falls, and I found that the pictures involving people were at least as interesting as the landscapes. Next. In 2006, I even had enough knowledge about Stoddard and enough images that were unusual or unique that I helped to collaborate on a PBS special about Seneca Ray Stoddard for WMHT. Next. And one of the things that I really liked about Stoddard's photography was the portraits that he would take of legendary Adirondackers, Albert Dunning, Verplanck Calvin, of course, the gentleman on the left in the central picture. He was the surveyor who surveyed the Adirondack Park, the first person to really create an accurate map of the Adirondack Park with Stoddard's help. Calvin hired Stoddard for his photography, but along the way, Stoddard learned the science and the art of surveying, and he ended up becoming a map maker on top of everything else. Some of the best maps ever made of the Adirondacks. But anyway, I really appreciated the photography that Stoddard did of people. Next. I also, of course, had to find every book that was ever written on Seneca Ray Stoddard, and these are all the books beside my own that have been published about Seneca Ray Stoddard. The one called Old Times in the Adirondacks is actually a reprint of one of Stoddard's own guidebooks. It was reprinted by DeSormo, who wrote the book that I've already mentioned. But these other books are all interesting in their own way about Seneca Ray Stoddard, and if you don't already have them, I can highly recommend every one of them. Next. So I had been working in the Adirondacks for Hudson Headwaters by this time, and I was making friends with and taking care of many Adirondack people, and many of whom were quite far along in their life history. And they could tell me these amazing stories about when they were young and what the Adirondacks were like then. And they were still living, in many cases, in very rustic fashion, almost as if they were still back in the early 20th century. And so I began to see them almost through the eyes of Seneca Ray Stoddard in terms of the artistic potential. And I started photographing my patients. And here's some examples here. Next. I also, of course, traveled through the Adirondacks. I was able to take my family hiking and exploring, and I certainly found the many structures and landscapes and scenery that Stoddard had seen himself 100 years earlier, and I began photographing these images as well. Next. So over the years, I photographed so many of my patients and wrote so many stories about them and photographed so many landscapes that I actually published 3 books during my medical career about my patients and my relation with them and where they lived and so on, and including a book, the 3rd book, which was about my patients who had been in World War II. My father was in World War II, and I was acutely aware how that population was disappearing rapidly. So I made a special effort to interview them, photograph them, borrow their memorabilia, such as pictures and so on. And I was able to create a book about Adirondackers who were all involved in World War II. Some truly amazing stories. If you haven't read that and you're interested in World War II, it's quite, I'm very proud of that book. Next. So I also found that there were so many other people interested in Seneca Ray Stoddard's works that I began scanning my own collection and putting it on a CD or a DVD that I would sell on eBay. I also was able to obtain rare copies of his rare travelogue. He wrote 2 travelogues in the late 1890s of cruises that he took to Europe and to North Africa. And this was in the era right after Mark Twain wrote The Innocents Abroad, which was a monster worldwide smash success book. It was the best-selling book in the world for years back in the 1890s. And of course, it inspired Stoddard to follow in a similar path. So he took a cruise, sort of like Twain did, and he wrote about it. He wrote funny anecdotes. He took lots of pictures, and he published these 2 books. One called The Cruise of the Friesland, 1895, and the Midnight Sun, where he traveled up through the Baltic and Northern Europe and Russia in 1897. So I scanned both of these books and put them in their entirety, including their illustrations, on another DVD. And then I also had a copy. I was given years earlier a manuscript written by Stoddard that had never been published, and it was in the hands of a gentleman who was an avid Stoddard collector who thought I should have it, and he gave it to me, and it was called A Trip to Europe, 1900. Stoddard never published it, and the manuscript was a tiny little thing that you could hardly read. The pictures were all faded. Most of it was written in his handwriting, which was not easy to read, but I managed to scan it and transcribe it, and so I have it in DVD form that I also market. And that's a truly unique object that he made. Next. So all of this made me feel that I had to write my own book about Seneca Ray Stoddard. I just couldn't help myself, and I had, some information and images and so on that other Stoddard students and aficionados would be interested in. And so I began working on the book as I was getting close to retirement. And in 2018, it just so happened that my daughter and my daughter-in-law were both pregnant at the same time and about to give birth to Harriet's and my third and fourth grandchildren. We thought that was a great excuse to retire from practice so we could be grandparents that would be available. And it also gave me the opportunity to start working on my book about Seneca Ray Stoddard. Next. So what I decided to do was approach Stoddard from a different direction than the other authors. Instead of writing a timeline type life story or life history of him, I decided to look at the different aspects of his genius that made him unlike anybody else I've ever been able to read about. So I talk about him as a photographer, the night photographer, map maker, how he learned to paint from the Hudson School of Artists. He was a sailor, traveler, humorist, etc. So these are all chapters in my book. There's 24 chapters, and each one addresses a different aspect of Stoddard's career and life. Next. I just briefly, I'll skim through a couple of the highlights. These are pictures from the chapter about his early life. The picture on the left is Stoddard's father, who was a troubled man. He came from a great family heritage, very many pious ministers from New England, but Charles Stoddard himself probably had some kind of mental illness, whether it was alcoholism or whether it was some kind of personality disorder is not known, but he was kind of a ne'er-do-well. He moved around a lot. He enjoyed fathering children, but he wasn't a very good parent apparently. But somehow Seneca Ray survived, and it was clear, or one would imagine anyway, that he wanted to get the heck out of town and start a new life for himself. So that's probably why he moved to Glens Falls almost the same time as my great-grandfather did. He met this young lady who was, her name was, she came from the Potter family, Augusta Potter. She was the daughter of the landlord or the real estate broker who put Stoddard up in his own home when he first came to town and helped him find place to live, and ultimately Seneca Ray bought a house on Elm Street in Glens Falls and married Augusta, and they had 2 children together. Meanwhile, he met a photographer, George Conkey. Stoddard had planned on being an artist when he moved to Glens Falls, but he met George Conkey, who was a photographer with a very new science and art of photography, and learned the art from Conkey, and immediately began taking pictures. As you can see, stereography was in its infancy. This is a stereograph Stoddard took of the falls in Glens Falls. And you could almost hear the wheels turning in Stoddard's head that this may be some way I could make a living. Next. So, but Stoddard, again, these pictures show the influence that the Hudson River School of Art had on Stoddard's photography. These 2 paintings here are paintings done by artists who are members of the Hudson River School of Art. And you can see how his composition mimicked the style of the Hudson River School in his photographs. And you'll see that in many of his photographs. So there was a real artistry to his photography from the very beginning. Next. So I began collecting Stoddard pictures. Like I say, they were much more available in those days. I'd go to auctions and antique stores, and this was pretty much before the internet and eBay came along. So I tried to grab images, books, anything I could get my hands on that had to do with Seneca Ray Stoddard. Next. So I also collected his guidebooks. His these lower books are meant for the visitors and sightseers that came to the Adirondacks, and he made a good living with these booklets, and he produced dozens, scores, probably hundreds of them over the long years of his career. He was just incredibly prolific, and he wrote the text, and he designed the covers, and did the artwork for the covers all by himself. He also did some work. If you look at the upper left book, that was published by the New York State Forestry Division, and that was a photograph that he contributed to the book. So there were many Stoddard pictures in those forestry books. Next. So just as Stoddard had inspired me to photograph my patients, his landscapes also inspired me to follow in Stoddard's footsteps, which actually is the title of a book by Mark Bowie, which I'll hold up here. It's called In Stoddard's Footsteps. Bowie did the same thing. He followed in Stoddard's footsteps, and I found myself mimicking not only Stoddard, but Mark Bowie in trying to recreate scenes that Stoddard had photographed. So even with my paddling buddies, my League of Extraordinary Adirondack Gentlemen that I paddle with, I took this, I had this picture that Stoddard took, and I was able to recreate it here on one of our camping trips. And this gentleman here in the lean-to is Peter Hornbeck. Next. So I was able to get another member of my league to pose for this picture because he just had a very eerie resemblance to William Nye, who was a legendary guide that Stoddard knew well. And I just found that when I was standing in the exact same footsteps as Seneca Ray Stoddard, when he would take a picture like Lake Henderson here in the heart of the Adirondack Forest, it's just a very spiritual feeling to not only see that scene, but to know that Stoddard saw that very same scene from that very same spot. Next. So one of the chapters in my book I devoted to how did the remaining Stoddard collection survive, and how did the two museums, the Chapman Museum in Glens Falls and the Adirondack Museum, come to possess huge collections of Stoddard's remaining memorabilia. And it turned out that it was Maitland DeSormo who had written the book that I was given years earlier. DeSormo not only wrote that book, but he did it because he had purchased all the remaining material that had been left behind by Seneca Ray Stoddard. Even though Stoddard died, he had books, manuscripts, maps, photographs, negatives, cameras, all kinds of stuff that was just laying around in his house, and nobody was living in the house anymore. In fact, the house was demolished sometime very soon after Stoddard died, I believe, because it was not in good repair. In any case, Stoddard's half brother's son, Hiram Stoddard, inherited all of this stuff. He didn't know what to do with it, so he put it in his basement, basically in his house, and it sat there for decades. And DeSormo was the one who heard about its existence, and DeSormo was able to buy the whole lock, stock, and barrel from Hiram Stoddard. And Stoddard was more than happy to get rid of it, and DeSormo turned it into a career. He wrote the book about Stoddard. He reprinted books by Stoddard, and he sold hundreds, if not thousands, of maps, guidebooks, and photographs in a store in Saranac Lake. But even after doing that for a number of years, there was still a huge trove of unsold material. And it turned out that he was willing to sell it to the Chapman Museum in Glens Falls and the Adirondack Museum. And so these two gentlemen you see pictured on the right were the men who negotiated the sale of half of the trove to the Chapman Museum. And I was able to take their picture in the Chapman Museum showing some of their favorite Stoddard items from the collection. Next. And I was particularly impressed by Stoddard's technology, grasp of technology, and photographing people at night. He even photographed the Statue of Liberty at night, which was a sensation. It got in the newspapers all over the country and even all over the world, partly because the Statue of Liberty was brand new when he took that picture, and so was the art of night photography. And so this was like a revelation for people to see this particular photograph, and he sold untold copies of it and made a booklet that he sold. So he probably made quite a profit from that. And he would photograph the nighttime campfire scenes of different groups of people. And the picture in the middle on the bottom is of Washington Square in New York City. And apparently he almost died taking that picture because the gunpowder that he was using for the flash, when it went off, it spilled down onto his head and set his face on fire. And it was only from the quick work of the firemen, who were actually part of the crowd in the picture, that saved him from permanent mutilation. I guess the fire was able to be extinguished, but even so, that alone created quite a sensation. Next. Stoddard, on top of everything else, was a sailor. He was a charter member of the Adirondack Canoe Association, and he had a canoe that called the Atlantis that he sailed, and it wasn't enough for him to sail in Lake George. He decided he was going to sail from Glens Falls all the way to Newfoundland in the Bay of Fundy, and he was going to do this over a period of 5 summers. At least that's how it turned out. He sailed from down a canal from Glens Falls down the Champlain Canal to Albany, and then from there down the Hudson to New York City. And then he, in 5 summers, going for perhaps 1 to 3 weeks at a time, he would sail as far north as he could in the Atlantic. And there were times when he capsized, he almost drowned a couple times, he lost a lot of material. He was rescued by various sea captains who happened to be near enough to pull him out of the water, and all to get to this destination in Grand Pre in Newfoundland. And I write about in this chapter about why he chose to go to that destination and what happened when he got there. Next. And of course, Stoddard is also famous for his amazing maps. The one on the left is very detailed. If you've ever seen a copy of it, it's incredible the amount of detail, the names of the mountains and the elevations and the topography lines. He learned how to make maps from not only following around with Verplanck Calvin, who himself was not a map maker but was a surveyor. And there was a man, Professor Eli, I think, who made the first map of the Adirondacks, but it was mostly blank. So Stoddard was the first one to make a really detailed, marketable map of the Adirondacks, and he produced them in increasingly detailed, accurate fashion year after year after year, and all the way till the age of the automobile, where he made maps for tourists who were driving through the Adirondacks. Next. So these are the cruise books I told you about. He did cruising and traveling abroad, and took many pictures and published these books. Next. And I write on a chapter about how I connected with Seneca Ray Stoddard as far as where my great grandfather and Stoddard connected. I inherited this picture you see in the upper left. This picture here, you may have seen it. It's been published in a number of places. I inherited a copy of it from my grandfather, and to my knowledge, I'm the only one who has a copy where the names of some of these kids and the location of this picture is known. This is my grandfather's handwriting on the back of the picture, and he talks about what year, 1887. He ended up thinking it was 1883. 42 Elm Street is this house here, which happens to be my great grandfather's house. And it turns out that these three kids are my great great uncle, my great aunt, and my grandfather as a child. And also these two boys in the foreground are Seneca Ray Stoddard's two sons, Charles and Herbert, or Leroy, I'm sorry, Charles Herbert and Leroy. And here's how the street looks today. This is my great grandfather's house. It's still standing, but I was able to prove their connection in the neighborhood by finding this 1875 map in the Glens Falls library showing Elm Street in Glens Falls, and here's South Street, and here is my great grandfather's house, James S. Garrett, 28 Elm Street, and if you look down here, you see S.R. Stoddard, 22 Elm Street. And these are all of the neighbors, including a potter. There's a potter here. Stoddard's wife was a potter. And this building down here, I believe, or the next one over was I think this one here says potter, was the office of her father, the realtor and lawyer, I think, among other things. So anyway, this is a very historic picture for me especially, and I describe this in more detail in a chapter of my book. Next. This picture here was hanging in my grandfather's house for many years, and it's because I knew that it was my grandfather's graduating class of 1898, Glens Falls High School graduating class. This is my grandfather. He was very gifted, and you can see he's younger than all the other kids in the group. He was probably 15 when he graduated from high school. There are only 4 or 5 men or boys in the picture. The only other person that was identified by my grandfather was this man here, Bill McCune, who went on to be a pianist who accompanied my grandfather in concerts. But then later on, I had the opportunity to meet Ernestine Stoddard, who was Seneca Ray Stoddard's last living blood relative, his great niece. And she was very elderly, 97. She was moving to a nursing home. She was liquidating her assets. And this picture was hanging on her wall. The other copy that my grandfather had went to my cousin, but I was able to get this same picture. And I wondered, why did she have this picture on her wall? It occurred to me that one of these people must have been a Stoddard. And so I did some research. I went to the Chapman Museum, and with the help of Bob Bale, who is a great historian that works at the Chapman Museum, he was able to find this picture here. We were looking at anything related to Stoddard in the museum, and he found this picture, which is obviously the same person as this gentleman here. Turns out that was Hiram Stoddard. That was Ernestine's father. He was the nephew of, or the great nephew of Seneca Ray Stoddard. Next. And this picture I inherited from my grandfather is a picture of my great grandfather, James Garrett. After he came back from the Civil War, he was the commanding officer of the 18 separate New York State militia. And he was a commanding officer for many years, as you can tell from this picture. He's a little long in the tooth, but here they are at camp. They would go out on maneuvers, and camp out and parade and everything from time to time. And these gentlemen here are apparently some of the senior officers in the company. I didn't know who they were, and I didn't know who took the picture, although I suspected that it might have been Stoddard because it was the exact same size print and on the same kind of backing as Stoddard's larger prints were. And again, Bob Bale was able to help me out with this gentleman here. And next. I guess that gentleman turned out to be Seneca Ray Stoddard's son, Charles, who became a military man himself and had a career as both a lawyer and as an officer in the United States Army. I have a chapter in the book about his first wife, Helen Augusta Stoddard. She was a potter, like I say, and he took these are all pictures he took of her. And as you can see in every picture, she is busting her butt doing, heavy work, lifting firewood, sorting firewood, working in the dark room, and also pushing either Bert or Charles in the buggy. Here she is working in this dark room with Emily Doty, who was the lab technician, and I don't know if she lived in the house with them or not, but she was very intimately associated with the Stoddard enterprise for decades and must have helped Helen a lot. Her name was Helen, but she went by the name of Gussie for Augusta. She was known as Gussie. Next. Stoddard late in his career, when he became more housebound as his wife's health deteriorated, he stayed at home more, which was unusual. So he started publishing this book or this magazine called Stoddard's Northern Monthly, which was revolutionary in that it was one of the first environmentalist books or magazines in existence, at least in the northeastern United States. He wrote many scathing articles and editorials about the collusion between the lumbermen and the state government, also the dam builders who were flooding rivers all through the Adirondacks so they could float logs downstream to the lumber mills in Glens Falls and ruining the shorelines of the rivers. So this was a very, very controversial magazine, and it only lasted for about a year because I guess it made some pretty heavy reading for a lot of people. Next. I have a chapter about historiography with some of my favorite examples of stereographs and how the reader, if they don't have a stereopticon, which is the old-fashioned viewfinder that you would use. I have a chapter where I was able to find pictures that Seneca Ray Stoddard took of the interior of his own house, which is quite an unusual thing for somebody to do. But it's great because, as I said, his house was demolished without a trace. I don't know if it was before he died or after he died. He had his health failed rather gradually toward the end of his life. But anyway, he took pictures. I was able to find 30 pictures of the inside of his house. So I have a whole chapter giving the reader a tour of his house, trying to piece together how the rooms connected and so on. It's pretty interesting. Next.
Sorry, Dan, it is not allowing me to move to the next slide. So,
Is there anything I can do?
No, I don't think so. I think that I will just.
Liz, I can run it from mine if that would help.
There aren't too many pictures left.
Okay, Mitch, if you do want to try running it from yours, let's give that a try.
Sure. Let me just switch it to presentation mode, and I should be ready to go.
I hope we didn't lose our audience.
Are you seeing that?
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
All right. I am going to try to get rid of the... Well, keep talking. As long as you can see that, I'll try to switch it too.
Well, you're looking at the picture from about the last chapter of my book about how Stoddard's at the end of Stoddard's life. You can see that he's in the backyard of his house on the left side there. He married Emily Doty, his lab technician, after his wife Gussie died, and the gentleman next to her is probably his half brother Frank Stoddard, who helped take care of him and actually helped build his house years earlier. So the picture shows Stoddard in a kind of an emaciated state, kind of disheveled, sitting there, and Frank appears to be holding a drill. I don't know what they're doing, but he's puttering around with something, and you can see the unkempt nature of the yard and the house, and so it probably explains why the house didn't survive much longer than he did. On the right, you can see where he was buried. These gravestones were not in existence until years after he died. He had dementia, and he was in a home a couple of blocks from Elm Street for a period of a year or two, and he died probably Alzheimer's disease. His wife Gussie had died 8 years earlier, and so he was buried in a very poor quality box in Pineview Cemetery, and I don't know what the marker looked like at that time, but years later, his son Leroy, his younger son Leroy, and his wife, who was an opera singer, did a fundraising appearance in Glens Falls to raise money to properly upgrade the burial site for Seneca Ray Stoddard. And by that time, his wife, Emily, well, she was still alive, but she was ultimately buried next to him. She outlived him by 19 years. She was much younger than he was. So the question arose in my mind, okay, so there's Seneca Ray and there's Emily Doty. Where is Gussie? And that was a question that I didn't have the answer to when I published my book, although I have since figured it out. Next slide. Anyway, these are just some of the other chapters in my book, looking at Stoddard from other directions, and you can see that he was he had many different hats and skills and talents. But there's 24 chapters in all. Next. This is just one of my favorite pictures, showing a group of lumberjacks in a lumber logging camp at night. And I just marvel at the quality of the picture, given that he used artificial light. I don't know if it was from a fireplace or he set off a small charge, but all these men are holding still. They're not moving. They're all more or less in focus, and the quality of the image is perfect. And he'd been doing this for many years by then, but you really have to take your hat off to him for the quality of his artistry. Next. Okay, well, that's the end of my formal presentation. I have a few other issues that I could talk about, but if you want to open things up for questioning, I'm okay with that for now.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for such a remarkable presentation and such an exhaustive, I was going to say snapshot, but it's really much more than a snapshot of Seneca Ray Stoddard's life.
Yeah, I can't help myself.
We already have a captive
audience.
We already have a number of questions from the audience, but I guess sure. I want to ask you a couple just to kind of propel the conversation forward, and then we'll jump right into the audience questions. I mean, one of the things that we learned through your research is that Stoddard was extremely good at publicizing his own work, and yet he's not as well known as some of the other kind of pioneering both photographers and just names in Adirondack history. Why do you think he hasn't necessarily gotten the same due as some of the other better known names?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think he's been well known for the last 20 years or so, at least regionally. I think when DeSormo's book came out, it really rediscovered him. But I mean, between Stoddard's death in 1917 and DeSormo's book in the 1970s, he just disappeared. And that's a very good question. I don't think anybody was in a position to maintain his business. I mean, there were still all these negatives and things. Somebody could have been marketing them and selling them, but I think when he died, Emily Doty was the only one, she or Frank Stoddard. I just don't think there was anybody there who was in a position to carry it on. So it just kind of withered and died.
And then I guess the other thing that amazed me maybe the most, considering what a terrific photographer he was, is that to read your account, it was just serendipity that introduced him to photography in the first place.
I think so. I mean, but I also think that he was a very smart man. He was very clever. He was a survivor. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but if you want to read about his early life, this is the book to read by Jean Winston Adler. You can find this book on eBay. It's a fantastic book, and she goes into great detail about his early life. His father dragged him around. His his siblings died of childhood diseases. His wife died. His mother died young. His father moved them around. He kept selling their farms and moving up to Malone and then back down, and his life was total chaos. So he couldn't wait to get out of there. And when he learned the art of painting in Troy from the marvelous artist that he rubbed shoulders with, who also kind of started from scratch like he did, he just couldn't wait to get out of Saratoga County. And Glens Falls was a booming community with the lumbering industry. It was a very rapidly rising positive community. It was not far away, so it was kind of a easy decision to make. And he just set up shop as an artist. There was this George Conkey like across the street practically, and Conkey hired him to paint a banner for him, and the rest is history. So he was lucky, but he also made his own luck, I think.
So to get to some of the questions that we've already gotten from our audience, you left us in suspense. Where was Gussie buried?
Where was Gussie buried? Well, let's see. I have a couple of slides if you want to, or I can just describe it. Basically,
are they yet in this presentation?
Yeah, they're in. If you scroll down maybe 3 or 4 slides, you can see a graveyard. You can see there's a picture of a graveyard.
Hold on one second.
But while you're doing that, I'll tell you
yes.
that I went to the City Hall of Glens Falls one day to pay my water bill. And as I walk into the City Hall, there's this pedestal there. And on the pedestal is an open booklet that is basically a list of all the people buried in the Glens Falls City Cemetery, which happens to be 2 blocks from my house. I can walk there from my house. And I just said, let me just look under the S's. Here we go. Let's look under the S's. And there was Stoddard. And I looked down and there was Augusta Stoddard and Thomas Stoddard, her father. So I was able to locate the exact location of the Potter family plot. So what you see here, this big monument, is Thomas Potter's and his wife's monument. And all these stones here are Potters, including this one here. This is Augusta. This is some siblings and other family members, but this one here is Augusta Stoddard. And next slide. If you can. If you can, there we go. So here's Augusta's stone right here. They call her Gussie, but next to it, this is what shocked me. Next to her was her son's gravestone. Charles Herbert Stoddard, the military guy that I showed you, he went by the name of Bert. He chose to be buried next to his mother, not his father. Now, why or how that was, I don't know. But Bert lived until 1943, so he certainly outlived his father by decades. And maybe there was money available for him to be buried there. There probably wasn't any money left in the Seneca Ray Stoddard account, that's for sure. So that's where Bert is buried. The younger son is buried downstate because he became a plastic surgeon in New York City, and he married an opera singer, and they spent the rest of their lives downstate. So that's where Gussie is buried.
And Jocelyn Pearson actually asks a follow-up question. Can you comment on Gussie's contributions to the running of Stoddard's photography business?
Well, he couldn't have done it without her. I mean, I'm sure she deserves all the credit for, I mean, again, there's no written record of, she didn't have a diary or anything like that. So we don't know, did she do the bookkeeping? There are pictures of Stoddard in his office, and you can see him sitting at his desk with ledgers behind him. I'm willing to believe that Gussie had a lot to do with keeping the records. Although you also, when you look at the other parts of the office, he's got Post-it notes like stuck on the walls, and it's really chaos, except for those ledgers. So I'm guessing that she probably had a lot to do with not only the bookkeeping, the housekeeping, But she also definitely did the printing. She developed, she printed the pictures in that dark room or light room, I guess I should say. She did a ton of work, and he was gone for weeks at a time. He took this cruise. I don't think his wife went with him. I may be wrong. There's no mention of her at all on either of those cruises. And he took other trips out west and down south. So he was gone for weeks at a time, frequently. And I feel bad for her, really, because I can't imagine that she was happy doing all this work. Maybe she was. Maybe it was unusual for a woman back in that day to be responsible for this very industrious business, but if she enjoyed it or got pleasure from it, there's no written record of her feelings about it.
A couple of people have asked about the origin of Stoddard's first name, Seneca, including Adam Stoddard, who asks, was his birth name Seneca? I've located the name Linus Ray Stoddard, matching his birth date while doing research.
No, his birth name was Seneca. The Stoddard family came from Massachusetts. They were very respectable clerical people, ministers and so on. And I think there were some politicians. And it was very common back in that era to take, if you had a son that you wanted to give him a name that would sound very, high class, you would pick the name of an emperor or somebody from the history. And Cicero would be one, and Seneca was a Roman. I don't know if he was a politician or a government official. I think he was a philosopher. But Seneca, you would think he was named after the Indian tribe, the Seneca Native Americans. But it turned out it was Charles, his father. Even though he was kind of crazy, he wanted to follow in the family tradition of picking a very lofty name for his firstborn son, Seneca. Oh. And Ray was his mother's maiden name.
We've had a number of people asking about other pictures that Stoddard may have taken that perhaps you know more about. One attendee wants to know if Stoddard ever photographed the Saratoga racetrack that you know of.
I have never seen a picture of the racetrack by him. I can't say whether he ever did or not. I've seen nothing to that effect.
Lorraine Plouth would like to know, she says she once saw a photo by Stoddard that showed the raising of the arm of Lady Liberty to put it in place, and it looked to her eye like an aerial photo, and she's tried to figure out how he could have taken the picture from that angle, though she's not found that photograph again. Are you familiar with that photograph?
The only thing I can think of is that you could get inside Lady Liberty and climb right up into her head. And he was, I think he was standing on the top of her head. He took a picture looking right down at her, at the crown on her head, and you could see her arm, and you could see New York Harbor below. I don't think it was an aerial photograph. I think he was standing on the top of the Statue of Liberty.
Wow.
Yeah. He would go wherever,
wow.
wherever the picture would take him.
Well, and the thing that really amazed me that you wrote about in a number of places actually was the idea that he would go to these places and bring essentially a portable darkroom with him.
Yeah. He didn't develop and print the pictures. He didn't bring the photographic paper or anything, but he would take the picture and put it in a chemical bath to kind of fix the silver on the glass, and but then they would have to keep it covered up in a sealed container, and then get it back to the house or back to his house, where they would then take it out and process it further from there. But yeah, he had to bring all those. He would actually have to take glass and pour the collodion gel onto the glass and wait for it to dry. It was kind of tacky and sticky. I think later in his career, these were commercially available, so it became easier. But yeah, at the beginning, he had to put the stuff on the glass himself. Of course, he had somebody with him. His brother-in-law, Charles O'Blennis, I should say, his brother-in-law came with him. He always had somebody with him probably a couple of younger people that we don't know the names of, but they all knew what they were supposed to do. So it wasn't totally a one-man job, but he just had somebody to help him.
And I think you're right. By the end of his career, he was using roll film, which had
Yes.
come along.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and which wasn't as good a quality as his original stuff, but.
We've had one of the earliest questions we got as you were showing the early pictures of you and your sister, I guess, at Lake George. The person was wondering whether those early Lake George pictures of your own are in this book.
And
I looked, I couldn't find them.
I don't think so. I don't think they are.
Anthony Antonucci has two very good questions. First, a very simple question. Is there a historical marker at the former site of Stoddard's house?
No, nope. It's a parking lot. There used to be a Chinese restaurant there. They tore it down. There's a big white, if you look at the corner of Elm Street and South Street, let's see, it would be the northwest corner. There's this big white brick building. It's painted white. It's all boarded up. It used to be some kind of a factory. It's about 3 stories high. They've been thinking of turning it into some new nursery industry for new businesses. But anyway, it's all boarded up. But his house would have been right next to that building where there's a parking lot.
And indeed, that brick building, is visible in some of the pictures that are from the interior of his house, as I recall.
Yeah.
He also wants to know, was Stoddard much of an Adirondack postcard photographer like others like Beach and Mandeville?
Yep, he did postcards too. He did just about everything. He made many postcards. I have quite a lot of them in my collection. Lake George. He did a postcard of Lake Tear of the Clouds, which is the top of Mount Marcy in the middle of winter. So yeah. He did a lot of postcards, but I think that kind of came later. But yeah, he definitely did postcards.
We have a handful of additional questions. One is, any idea how much Stoddard charged clients for his photos?
Yeah, they tended to be, a couple dollars. Some of the big ones could be $5. But you might say, "Oh, that's cheap," but $5, that wasn't. You could probably live off that for a few days. But I think his postcards were like 25 cents, 50 cents.
Jerry McGovern has a question about your own work. He writes, I was impressed by the photos in your earlier books. Your treatment has the dignity of Walker Evans, and he's wondering, is Walker Evans an influence for you?
Yes, Walker Evans. I have a wonderful book about Walker Evans, and he definitely is one of the artists who inspired me.
Sally Sheldon is wondering, you mentioned the chronology, but not the exact year. When did Seneca's first wife pass away?
1906.
Jocelyn Pearson
She was 56 years old.
Yeah. Jocelyn Pearson is also wondering, have you had an opportunity to retrace any of Stoddard's steps in any of his places abroad?
Yes. That third manuscript that I told you about that was never published, that I scanned and transcribed, it was a very mysterious manuscript. It said a trip to Europe to the 1900. And when I looked through it, at first I didn't know what it was of, although I began to recognize some pictures that were of Paris. And not only of Paris, but of the Eiffel Tower in Paris. And apparently the Eiffel Tower was built or finished around 1900. So they had a world exposition there. So this was basically the world exposition of 1900. He went to that. That's specifically why he went there, although he went to Spain and Italy too. But he took pictures of the Eiffel Tower and from the Eiffel Tower. And I have, I showed you that DVD that I have where I transcribed and scanned all the images, and it's in that document, which I think I have the only original copy of it, and I think I've only sold a couple of those DVDs. So if anybody wants one, just check my get through to me on my website.
Get them before they're gone.
Right. I can always crank out more.
Yeah, couple more quick questions here.
Sure.
Kevin Roberts would like to know where exactly is Stoddard's gravesite located?
It's in the Pineview Cemetery in Queensbury. It's on the northeastern corner of the intersection between Route 9 and Quaker Road. And it's in the far northernmost road in the graveyard under some tall trees. It's kind of up in a corner as far back in the cemetery as you can go, all the way to the right side or the northeastern side of the cemetery. And it's right under a great big tall pine tree. You know, it's pretty easy to spot if you have an idea around where it is.
We did have Annabelle points out that one of our attendees has posted a couple of links to more information about Stoddard's photos from the Statue of Liberty, which people might find interesting. Donna Williams would like to know, is there a map anywhere of the locations where Stoddard took many of his pictures?
I don't believe so. I don't think anybody's ever made a map, but he went everywhere. I mean, he was over so many places, it would be hard to imagine a map that you could make of everywhere that he went. If you get a copy of his guidebooks, and a lot of their reprints are easily available on eBay, you can certainly get a sense of where all the places he traveled to.
A couple of comments people have left. One person wrote, I learned about Seneca Ray Stoddard while working for the LG Steamboat Company. They do a great job commemorating him in the captain's narrations of the lake. And another person just says, thank you, gave me lots of new intelligence. I've been a fan of Stoddard's work since the 80s and admired his photo techniques and gray images. And a question about whether you're working on books about more contemporary Adirondack photographers, people like Nathan Farb or Carl Heilman.
No, they're still alive, so I think I'll let them speak for themselves. I wouldn't deign to write about them, but I know them both well, and they're great photographers. I take my hats off to them.
One person asks, why wasn't Stoddard more affluent after being so prolific?
That's a very good question. I just don't think that it was important to him. And I don't really know how he lived very, very meagerly at home. I mean, if you're judging by his house and everything, he probably spent quite a bit of money, on traveling and so on. So I don't know that he ever had a lot of wealth at any one time. Probably, especially as he got toward the end of his life, he invested money in his magazine, the Adirondack Stoddard's Northern Monthly magazine. It went belly up in about a year. I don't know how much money he invested in that, but it certainly didn't sell well. It made some enemies, political enemies for him, and so I just don't think there was ever a time when he had a lot of fluidity in his finances to work with.
And Anthony Antonucci just left a comment as well. The books on Stoddard by DeSormo and you, and other books on other Adirondack photographers by Bogdan and others, are a great homage to these Adirondack photographers and their work and passion for the Adirondacks. All of you authors should be commended on your works. It's produced a great legacy of these people for all of us.
Yeah, thank you.
And I guess in closing, I had one more question that I wanted to ask you. One of the really remarkable aspects of your book is these images we see of the inside of Stoddard's house, and we see many of the images on his walls. And you write that he ran out of room on his walls, so there are images that are propped up next to walls and on easels. Yeah. Can you peel back the curtain for us? Are there images that are by Stoddard that are on your walls in your home there that you're especially keen on?
You mean this picture here? This is one of my favorite Stoddard pictures of all time, and this was scanned from the original, which I own, and it was blown up by a gentleman who collaborated with me on the PBS special, Richard Linke. He's a photography professor at I think down in Saratoga. So he made that print for me, and it's gorgeous. That's definitely my all-time favorite, and it shows these guides playing cards at night, and the title of the game is or the title of the picture is Game in the Adirondacks, and it's a pun. You see, there's a rifle here, so you're thinking game. Oh yeah, they're hunters. Yeah, well no, they're playing cards. They're playing a card game. So that was an example of Stoddard's humor. But yeah, that's my favorite. Except for the one of Elm Street, where that has my grandfather in it.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I imagine, as someone who's been doing this research for so long, you're still kind of keeping your eyes out for the Stoddard picture you might have missed that's sitting in somebody's attic or barn somewhere. Yeah,
actually, there's something really strange happened. I got contacted by a gentleman who found in a yard sale a trunk belonging probably to Seneca Ray Stoddard. It's a huge steamer trunk covered with canvas. In fact, I think it's in my slideshow at the very end, the last slide. And he found that in a yard sale. And the woman said, well, I bought it in a yard sale like 20 years ago from another elderly lady, and blah, blah. So it's not clear whether that was from Ernestine Stoddard or what, but it has SRS, Glens Falls, New York. Now, you could argue SRS, that could be anybody, but there aren't too many people with that monogram, and he always went by SRS. So I think that was Seneca Ray Stoddard's trunk that he used, on his voyages, on his cruises and his trips out west and so on.
Oh, that's great.
And that'll probably end up in the Chapman Museum at some point.
Well, Daniel Way, just a remarkable view, pun intended, of a remarkable guy, and I thank you so much for sharing this story, and I know all of our audience members do as well. And I'll turn things back over to Liz at the Adirondack Experience.
All right, thanks so much, Mitch.
Thank you. And Dan, I will echo Mitch's sentiments. Thank you for sharing your extensive knowledge with us tonight. And Mitch, thank you for facilitating a great conversation. And of course, thank you to everyone who's tuning in tonight from your homes or wherever you may be this evening. So we invite you next month to join us for another installment of this program on April 15th. We will be featuring author Lorraine Duvall and her book, Where the Styles Brook Waters Flow, the place I call home. And if you enjoyed tonight's Zoom program, you may also enjoy our Eclipse Experience Zoom series. Our next program will take place on Wednesday, March 20th from 7 to 8 p.m. and will feature Dr. Michael West from the Lowell Observatory out in Flagstaff, Arizona, as he presents on the mysteries of eclipses and how these breathtaking events have shaped human history, culture, and our understanding of the universe as we move closer to the total solar eclipse on April 8th here in the Adirondacks. For more information, yep, exactly. For more information and to register for our upcoming Zoom programs, you can visit the adkx.org/events. And with that, we will conclude tonight's program. Thank you again for joining us, and take care.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.